Skin Deep, written and narrated by Saffron Bryant. Chapter 3. Ravyn paced beside the back wall of her workshop like a nervous cat. Excited murmurs echoed against the bare walls and beat against her eardrums. People milled between the broken vehicles, gazing up at the television. Dorabella stood at the front of the crowd, hands clasped in front of her body as she watched the poles climbing. "Ravyn, you're ahead of everyone except Queen Elena." The rock in Ravyn's stomach dropped lower and nausea rolled through her. Dorabella turned and grabbed hold of Ravyn's arm, pulling her to a stop. "Did you hear me?" Ravyn ripped her arm away, nostrils flaring. "Yes, I heard you, but I told you yesterday that I wanted nothing to do with it, and now you've invited all these people to my house." Dorabella stuck out her bottom lip. "Don't be like that. I'm throwing this party for you." Ravyn raised an eyebrow and glanced around at the Undesirables refilling drinks and laying out plates of food for the desirable guests. "You're throwing it?" Dorabella rolled her eyes. "It's bad enough that they're uncovered. You don't have to make a scene for them as well. Look, poor Lady Mayflower is struggling to eat because of it." Ravyn glanced up at the lady in question. She wore a hat covered in flowers and held a handkerchief to her mouth as she glared at the nearest undesirable. Her pale face gleamed with a thin sheen of sweat. "If that puts her off her food, then I hope she vomits." Dorabella shook her head. "It's not her fault. He is particularly hideous, even for an undesirable." Ravyn bit back a sharp response. She knew the man, Jones, and had always found his wide mouth endearing, especially when stretched into his familiar broad smile. Of course, there was no sign of that smile today. "You know you used to treat them the same as everyone else, like people." "Yes, and then I grew up. It's time you did as well." Ravyn gritted her teeth and went back to pacing. "It's nearly finished," squeaked a young woman. Dorabella rushed to the front of the crowd, pushing Atoll out of the way as she went. "Ravyn, come on!" Ravyn turned away and glared down at an oil stain on the floor. She couldn't bear to look. Bile rose to the back of her throat and her shoulders tensed. She felt like a hunk of meat, laid out on display for a horde of ravenous lions. "Not me," she whispered. She swallowed, but her mouth remained dry like aged parchment. She clenched her hands and pinched her eyes shut. "It's you!" Dorabella screamed as the crowd erupted into cheers. Ravyn's heart stopped and she fell to her knees. "No, it's a tie," Lady Mayflower called. People gasped and then gaped at the scream. "There hasn't been a tie in decades. What happens now?" Dorabella's high-pitched squeal cut through the rest of the crowd. "A parade! They'll have to hold a parade!" Ravyn's stomach did another flip. A parade. She'd be put on display, her looks compared to Queen Elena to determine the true ruler. If she lived that long. Hands grabbed her shoulders and hauled her to her feet, but she barely felt them. Dorabella's grinning face filled her vision, and for a moment they were children again, bubbling with excitement because they were classed as desirable. Then reality crashed back around her ears like a shattering window. Ice filled her veins. She had to leave. Ravyn shook off the grabbing hands and dashed away from the workshop, through her small house. She ducked under a low arch and into the alcove she used as a bedroom. Snatching a bag from under her unmade bed, she shoved in a change of clothes. Her travelling toolbox followed, clattering to the bottom and leaving flakes of rust across her sheets. "What are you doing?" Dorabella said, bursting into her room. "Leaving," Ravyn said without looking up. "What do you mean, leaving? There'll be people here from the royal court at any moment to take you to the palace." "Which is exactly why I have to leave now." "Ravyn, you're not making any sense. What are you so worried about?" "I'm worried about this whole system." Dorabella groaned and rolled her eyes. "If you're so worried about the system, then why are you running away? If you win, you'll be queen, and then you can make it into whatever system you like." "She won't let me win. In fact, I doubt I'd even make it to the parade." "What are you talking about?" "Don't you think it's weird that she's been in power for 20 years? "No, she's beautiful. She deserves to be there." Ravyn yanked the zip closed and hurled her bag over her shoulder. "I don't think so, but I don't have time to explain it to you. I'm leaving." Dorabella snatched Ravyn's arm and spun her around. You can't leave. There are people out there waiting to celebrate with you, and even if that wasn't enough to stop you, you know the Queen will find you. It's not like you can hide. Everyone knows what you look like. Ravyn's stomach clenched and she bit her lip. Dorabella was at least partly right. I don't have a choice. Please, can you just for once trust me? I have to go. The people have chosen you. If you leave, you're throwing that in their faces and avoiding your responsibility. Red flushed Dorabella's cheeks as she glared at Ravyn. I didn't ask for any of this. Dorabella threw her hands into the air. None of us did. I certainly didn't ask for a best friend who was an idiot, but you won the fairest of them all, so now you have to live with the responsibility that comes with that. Ravyn stepped to the door and looked back. I really don't. Dorabella's lips pressed together, chin trembling. If you leave, I don't know if I'll ever be able to talk to you again. Ravyn swallowed and ignored the burning prickle at the corners of her eyes. I hope one day you'll understand. She ducked under the arch and raced for her front door before Dorabella could reply. She burst out into a thin alley filled with people. They gaped at her and yelled out her name. Some snatched for her hands and stroked her face like a good luck charm. Most of them had undesirable tattoos, but a growing crowd of desirables surrounded them, pushing forward to get to Ravyn's door. There she is! I was here first! Lady Ravyn, let me escort you to the castle! The clamouring voices washed over Ravyn like a wave, and she felt herself sinking. Her chest tightened, and each breath came out as a ragged gasp. More hands grabbed hold of her and pulled her forwards up the hill towards the castle. She twisted her hand and wrenched her arm free, darting in the opposite direction, deeper into the undesirable district. Her shoes slapped against the bare cement, and her bag bounced against her shoulder. The crowd surged behind her, chasing and calling her name. Together the voices and racing footsteps sounded like a great monster chasing her through the narrow streets. She imagined the great beast opening a wide mouth ready to swallow her whole. She darted left into a side street and slammed her right elbow against a pile of empty crates. Pain flew up her arm and her left elbow tingled into numbness. It dropped to her side like a dead fish while the rest of her body pumped harder. The buildings on either side pressed closer until her shoulders rubbed against the walls. She glanced back to the crowd. They'd been forced into single file, and some, mostly desirables, had given up the chase, standing at the mouth of the alley gaping. She sprang forward with new speed, breathing hard. Tendrils of black hair flicked loose and whipped about her head. The alley spilled out into a wider street where people stood staring up at the buildings where towering television screens glowed with Ravyn's portrait. The undesirables stopped talking and gawked at her as she burst out of the alley and darted down the street. A sharp clatter signaled that not all of her pursuers had given up. Speakers blared the results of the poll from every corner, repeating her name over and over until she was sure she would go mad. A special announcement from Queen Elena, the speakers boomed. Dear citizens, what a triumphant day. I am so excited that we will be having a parade. A tie in the fairest of them all hasn't happened for over 30 years. It seems that a parade is overdue. Dim cheers surged through the speakers after the Queen's words. Unfortunately, the royal escort has been unable to find Lady Ravyn. I'm quite disappointed because I was so looking forward to meeting her. I'm sure she's just nervous. I know I was when I was appointed fairest of them all. More than anything, I want to make sure she's safe. So if you see her, please inform the royal escort so that we can give her all the help she deserves. There is, of course, a reward for anyone who can help locate her. Ravyn's mouth twisted. She couldn't deny that the Queen had a way with words. Even she could almost believe that the Queen wanted to help. There she is, called a man in a white apron. Bony fingers clamped around Ravyn's wrist and yanked her to the side of the road. The hand belonged to an old woman with deep wrinkles and grey hair. I've got her! The reward is mine! Just you hold still, dear. We'll have you back with the royal escort in no time. Let me go, Ravyn said, wrenching her arm back. The old woman's nails dug in and left thin trails of blood up Ravyn's arm. Just stay there, my pretty. Ravyn whirled around, but people surrounded her, their eyes shining. I saw her first. Well, I grabbed her. I'm the one that's going to catch her. That makes her mine. Ravyn took a faltering step forward, but more people filled the gaps, grinning. "Ravyn, this way!" She barely glanced at Jerry before darting towards him, slipping between two burly men who were trying to block her way. Jerry held open a solid wooden door, his knuckles white against the frame. His usually cheerful face had lost all colour and stood out pale against his red hair. Ravyn brushed past him, through the door and into the room beyond. Her heart raced as the dim interior engulfed her. The door thumped shut, and Jerry slammed the lock home. The yelling voices and commotion of the street faded behind the thick wood. "You have to keep moving. It won't be long before the royal escort gets here." Ravyn took a rasping breath, barely able to contain her emotions as adrenaline surged through her body. "Ravyn, you have to keep moving." She shook her head and met Jerry's eyes. "What?" "Atoll told me what you'd found. He warned me to be ready just in case." Ravyn swallowed and a cold wave rushed over her. "Atoll, I didn't see him." "He knows. But all he wants is for you to be safe, and right now that means moving." Ravyn hoisted her bag higher on her shoulder and took a deep breath. "I have to get out of the city, but everyone knows my face." Jerry nodded. "I know. Here, wear this." He tossed her an undesirable mask. She pulled the strap over her head and settled the plastic over her face. It bit into her cheeks and the thin mouth slit made it hard to breathe. "There, I can barely recognize you already." Ravyn nodded and squared her shoulders. "Thank you. You've been nicer to me than almost anyone. It's the least I can do for the new queen." Ravyn's stomach dropped and she faltered, snatching the doorframe for balance. "Too soon?" Jerry said, a flicker of a grin flashing across his face. "Come on, there's a back exit. No one should recognize you." Ravyn nodded and followed him through a series of small rooms filled with discarded belongings. The mask pressed against her injured nose and made it throb, but she didn't dare take it off. Jerry stopped in front of a bare metal door with a long scratch running down its middle. "Here we are." Ravyn bit her lip and nodded. "Tell Atoll—" "I will. Now leave. Do whatever you have to do. I hope I see you again one day." Ravyn threw her arms around his chest. "Me too." Before the tears could break free, she pushed him away and ripped open the door. She stepped into the street beyond and closed the door behind her before taking another deep breath. The alley lay empty except for an elderly woman throwing wet clothes over a frayed piece of rope. She glanced up at Ravyn, grimaced, and turned away, uninterested. Ravyn stepped away from the door, legs shaking. She expected the sounds of pursuit and recognition to go up at any moment, but the desolate alley remained silent. A cool breeze brushed Ravyn's skin and she took another step. 3 paces later she burst into a sprint, feet pounding against the pavement. Every wall held a screen, and every screen showed a picture of her. The Queen's appeal for help played on repeat through the old speakers, blaring down at her from every street corner. People gazed up at the screens and spoke to each other, but they barely glanced her way as she ran past. 10 minutes later, the buildings crowded so close together that a car couldn't fit between them. The people here wore tattered rags and dirt smudged across their faces. A man with one hand swept the path in front of his house, while a young girl with milky white eyes turned to face Ravyn's running footsteps. Fewer screens dotted the walls in this part of the city, and the Queen's message was only just audible through broken speakers. "Good people. It seems poor Lady Ravyn is even more shy than we'd thought. She may be disguised as an undesirable and hiding in the lower city. Let's find her and show her that it's not so bad. The reward for finding her is now 10,000 gold pieces." Ravyn gasped and stumbled to a halt. 10,000 gold? That was more than most undesirable made in 10 years. That was enough to kill for. Cold sweat burst across her forehead as she turned in a slow circle. The man hadn't stopped sweeping, and the girl looked oblivious, but she had no idea who else was watching. For that kind of money, it wouldn't be long before the whole district was turned upside down in its search for her. Her heart beat faster and she turned in another tight circle. The city limits weren't far, but after that, where would she go? Her eye caught on a rusted hover bike leant against the side of a nearby building. The padding on the seat spilled out of the seam, and only shattered glass remained of the headlight. She looked up and down the alley, but no one seemed to be paying her any attention. She sidled to the bike and felt around the ignition. No keys. She swallowed. She didn't want to jumpstart it, but she had to get away, and her options were running out. She stretched her hand down under the handlebars to the wiring and fiddled with the ignition switch. At the same time, she pulled off her shoe with her other hand and pretended to examine it for a pebble. Ravyn tugged out the ignition wires and with one hand rubbed them together. They crackled, but nothing more. She tried again. This time the bike spluttered and died. She took a deep breath and did her best to look nonchalant, even though the man had stopped sweeping and was staring at her with watery eyes. The third time she rubbed the wires together, the bike roared into life, spluttering and lifting a few inches off the ground. Ravyn didn't stop to admire her work. She threw her bare foot over the seat and slammed the throttle forward, her shoe clasped in one hand. The bike jumped, sending pieces of trash skittering against the sides of the buildings. In the closed alley, the roar of the engine echoed back and amplified, filling the quiet street with noise. Someone behind her shouted, but she didn't look back. At the end of the alley, she pulled down on the left handlebar to turn. It creaked against the rust and resisted, leaving the bike careening straight for the far wall. Her heart leapt into her throat as she pushed her whole weight down on the handle. It screeched and broke free. The bike whipped left, but not fast enough. The front tire just missed the far wall, but Ravyn's knee scraped against the hard concrete, her skin shredded, leaving a bloody trail along the bricks. Pain exploded up her leg and sank deeper into her muscles as her fingers clenched around the handles. She cried and glanced down. Her leg gaped open in a massive cut that stretched from her knee to her upper thigh. The rough brickwork had chewed straight through her jeans and into the flesh beneath. Blood dribbled out and soaked the fabric, dripping down to leave a trail on the road behind her. She clenched her jaw to keep from crying and focused on getting out of the city alive. The narrow alleys threatened to crush her with every turn, whilst the bike's rusted handles made it impossible to steer. After 3 more near misses, the bike leapt out of an alley onto the main road of the city. The paved thoroughfare teemed with people. The Desirables wore their best clothes, while Undesirables scurried past, masks firmly in place. Ravyn yanked on the handle and pointed the bike for the arched entrance, her one way out of the city. It glimmered above the people like a heavenly gateway. The bike rattled along the road and people dove out of the way. Desirables cursed after her, but she didn't slow. She pushed the bike at top speed through the gateway and out into the surrounding wasteland. Red dirt lay around her like a vast ocean, while the road snaked across the landscape like a black river, disappearing on the horizon in the sharp gleam of the sun. She pushed the throttle and shot away from the gates, into the unknown. Make sure to like and subscribe so that you'll know when new chapters are released.